Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this month's webinar from the Office for Prevention of Family and Domestic Violence. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm joining you from Wallilla on Whadjuk Noongar Budja and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also pay my respects to the traditional owners of the lands that many of you might be meeting us on today across the state. So my name is Nicole Leggett and I'm the Director of the Office for Prevention of Family and Domestic Violence, and today we're going to talk to you about a few different things that are happening in the office, two of which came out of our last month's webinar. We had requests in the chat to give a little bit more of an update on what's happening in the department around the family and domestic violence response teams. People were interested in hearing about some of the work to refresh the common risk assessment and risk management framework. So we'll address both of those things, and I have Nigel here to speak to us about the response teams, and Kerry-Ann Smith will be with us to talk about common risk assessment. I'll be providing an update on the commissioning project. And to start, I also wanted to give you an update on just a couple of project milestones that were reached this week on a couple of other projects. So Zoe, I'll just get you to move the slide. And one more. So as I think you all know, one of the responsibilities of the Office for Prevention of Family and Domestic Violence is to support implementation of the government's election commitments concerning family and domestic violence. And 3 of those election commitments reached an important milestone over the last week. So on Monday, we released on Tenders WA the expression of interest for the Rapid Rehousing Initiative. And Rapid Rehousing is a program that is about supporting access for women escaping family and domestic violence to the private rental market. There will be 2 pilots established in WA. One of those will be specifically for Aboriginal women and children. People can apply to run both of the pilot initiatives, or we can receive separate expressions of interest for each of them. The only condition is that the delivery of the pilot for Aboriginal women and children needs to be led by or involve an Aboriginal organisation as one of the primary partners. Rapid Rehousing is really about providing support for women to access the private rental market, as I said, but doing that by subsidising bond and subsidising weekly rent. So in the documentation that you can see on Tenders WA, there's some examples of how that might occur. And we're offering a non-mandatory briefing tomorrow to give people a little bit more information about that tender process. So you can hear a little bit more about that initiative tomorrow if you sign into that non-mandatory briefing. And also in the documentation that's currently available on Tenders WA, there's quite a lot of detail in there about what the expectation is, what we're looking to achieve from the pilot, but also some examples, as I said, of how we expect that it could possibly work. The other thing that was released on Tenders WA this week is the grants round for primary prevention. So one of the government's election commitments was around boosting primary prevention in WA, and that really has 3 main components in terms of the work that the office is carrying. One being the expansion of the Respectful Relationships Teaching Support Program that's run through Sturrock Services. The second being an expansion of respectful relationships into the sport and recreation industry. And then the third being a whole body of work around supporting primary prevention activity in the state. So the release of the grants round is one part of that piece of work. The other part is that we funded the Centre for Women's Safety and Wellbeing to develop a primary prevention framework, to provide training into the sector around primary prevention, and also to support the people who are successful in that grants round through a community of practice, to provide an opportunity to share what they learn as they go, but also to sort of build that skills and capacity in our workforce around primary prevention initiatives. So the total pool of funding that is assigned to that primary prevention grant round is $3 million. And we've, I guess, indicated in the grants paperwork that we're looking for 2 tiers, if you like, of application. So we're looking for around 8 applications, or we're looking to award 8 grants that are in the vicinity of $150,000 to $250,000. So 8 larger scale initiatives, and then as many other initiatives as would fit in a range of around $80,000 to $100,000. And really, I guess we would encourage anybody who's got an interest in primary prevention to be thinking about what they might like to do in this space. The expectation is that it will be very much about prevention-focused initiatives that are looking to address what we understand to be the drivers of violence against women, including family and domestic violence. And we point people in the paperwork to be thinking about or be going to Our Watch as, I guess, a primary place to understand what those drivers were and what some of the options are for treating or addressing those drivers. We will offer a briefing session for that one as well, but we're just working out the date at the moment. So once that date is settled, then we will send that around to give people a bit of an opportunity to hear a bit more from us about what that grant round is all about. The third thing that commenced this week is consultation to inform the design of the Kimberley Hub. So last week we held a webinar with our Kimberley colleagues and stakeholders to start to talk about what the experiences have been in Mirrabooka and Kalgoorlie, what the very early learnings are that are coming out of the hub evaluation, what some of the design work has looked like for Armidale, and then also what that sort of forward design process was going to look like in the Kimberley. We have got consultants on board for that piece of work. That's the innovation unit, and they are in the Kimberley this week, starting that design process, which will carry on for the next 6 weeks, I would say. So that is just a couple of updates, and any questions that you've got around any of those three things, please pop them in the chat. And as always, if you particularly like a question that you see in the chat, please like it so we know to prioritise it at the end in our responses. I guess the other key thing is, which I didn't mention at the outset, is usually the format of these webinars is that we provide information for about 30 minutes and then provide about 30 minutes for Q&A. So please post your questions as you think of them, and we'll get to them at the end to make sure we get them all covered. The next item that I wanted to talk about, which came up as a request at last month's webinar, is about the family and domestic violence response teams. So at our last webinar, I talked to you about the structure of the Office for Prevention of Family and Domestic Violence. What I wasn't able to say at that point, which we have the opportunity to talk about today, is that in addition to the 3 streams of work that we spoke about last week, being policy, system reform and practice, the Family and Domestic Violence Response Team Central Coordinating Team will also be stood up in the Office for Prevention of Family and Domestic Violence. And that will occur from the 29th of August with the commencement of Nigel Van Santen in the acting manager's role for that team. And we're running a recruitment process to recruit to the other positions. Linda, can I get you to move down? So I'm going to hand over to Nigel to talk to you about the work of FDVRT Central, including where it's at and what some of our sort of more immediate priorities are. But I guess I would just say that for me, the most immediate priorities that we'll be looking to do from that date of establishment on the 29th of August will be around reconvening our governance in this space, particularly the strategic steering group and forming an operational steering group, about re-engaging everybody, commencing the partner meetings. And I believe on that same date, we're actually, myself and Joe McCabe are coming out to a meeting of the Coordinated Response Service Providers convened by the Centre for Women's Safety and Wellbeing. So that will help us, I guess, get oriented fairly quickly, I think, to what some of the current issues are, so that we can really, I guess, get on with our forward planning and action in this space. But please let me hand over to Nigel Van Santen, who's online with us and can talk to us about the FDVRT work.
Great, thanks Nicole, and yeah, look, thanks everyone for this opportunity to provide a little bit of an update on where we are with FDVRTs and establishment of FDVRT Central in particular. So I'm mindful that we might have some attendees online, in particular perhaps some of our non-government CRS service providers who may be aware of some of this information that was provided back in May. So hopefully this is an opportunity for a little bit of an update from where we left off from there. But for others, I'll just go back a little bit to May. So there was an announcement by Minister McGurk, which you might have seen on through a media statement. We were successful in receiving some additional funding for the FDVRTs. It was a total of $7.7 million over 5 years. 1.2 million of that was for the Department of Justice. Now, the reason why it was a little bit there was for the Department of Justice is, if you're not aware, we've actually had some success in getting Justice as a new partner agency in the FDVRT model. And by Justice, I mean the adult community corrections part of Justice. It's certainly not entirely new. There has been some thinking in the past. If you sort of have been around for a while, you'll remember there has been some attempts in the past to have adult community corrections as a core partner, and they have been a core partner up in the Kimberley for some time as well, because there's some natural synergies, as you'd imagine, in terms of information sharing in both ways. In particular, some visibility around what adult community corrections are doing for some of our high-risk offenders, and so that helps our FDVRTs, manage some better safety planning if they've got better visibility of what ACC are doing, and vice versa. ACC need to have some visibility over what's happening in the response teams, and in particular, really just when there's new police reports coming in for offenders. That's just a real logical one that we need to join that link. So that's quite exciting, and we've got a pilot underway in the Fremantle district, and we'll be closely evaluating how that's going so that we can kind of have a bit of a statewide rollout in the coming few months, really. The other part, so breaking down that $7.7 million, it was inclusive of what Nicole had mentioned, is establishing a central support and coordination team, which we're calling FDVRT Central. The other little elements that we were successful is really getting some funding for workforce development, and alongside that we're focusing on developing a workforce development plan. So it's really, rethinking the training and the workforce development that has been in existence for these FDVRTs, and trying to build in that sort of consistent approach and that foundation training. We've had a few curveballs along the way, and no doubt there'll be a couple of stakeholders online who are familiar with some of the changes, the shifting sands that are happening in WA Police at the moment. So we're just sort of working through that, because if we're now working with rotational officers in police, we're going to kind of have to adjust our thinking a little bit around workforce development. And the other part is a redevelopment of the triage application, which is quite outdated at the moment. So we feel like we've got a great opportunity now to actually really shape that database to help with information sharing, but also things like referrals, generating referrals out to key partner agency, really opening up the doors to FDVRT rather than being a bit of a closed shop sort of initiative. And then the other part, the final part of all that funding, and that we could have secured some funding for a little bit longer term, but we were able to continue the WA Recovery Plan funding for the CRSs for an additional 7 months. So just recognising that that's brought a lot of benefit to the FDVRTs, and we'd like to see sustainable funding for the CRSs to be able to undertake that important role, but it sort of definitely gives us a bit of extra time to have some further conversations and work out where we go from there. As Nicole said, one of the big sort of things that we've been managing it in recent times since May, and certainly I think we were all sort of hoping we might have been a little bit further along the track since May, but we've had some developments, quite exciting ones really, and as Nicole said, it's really the standing up of the Office for the Prevention of FDV, and we saw the opportunity there to have FDVRT Central sitting under the Office for the Prevention of FDV, just the benefits that we can get by being closely aligned to that statewide strategic planning, closer to sort of funding decisions and stuff like that, closer to the minister's sort of intent and things like that. So we just thought it was a really good opportunity, but with that comes a little bit of time, and we have to kind of work that out and get approvals and things like that. So that has been a little bit of has added to a little bit of delays, but we think it's a delay that's well worth waiting for. In terms of priorities, I know I've only probably got a minute or so left to go, but certainly the priorities that are on the screen is what we're going to be really focusing on the outset when we get FDVRT Central up and running. And a lot of this that I've been talking about stems from, if you're familiar with it, the FDVRT review report, which was written back in 2020. So these are the things that we keep close in our minds as we're doing this work. And what we heard really was that the governance is really lacking. So we really want to re-establish our governance for the FDVRT model, re-establish the FDVRT operational steering group that some people will be familiar with in the past, to really have some solid oversight of the response team model. Another thing that came out really quite loudly from our frontline staff was something that happened in the past was the partner agency meetings, bringing staff together and agencies either together and separately, so that CRS had the opportunity to kind of come together as a CRS work unit to share and discuss the issues that are affecting them, same as our senior child protection workers, same as police, and then also that opportunity to come together as a collective. So we really see that that's an important thing that we need to reinvigorate and come out and get those happening again, especially at this time now. People are sort of familiar with some of the changes that are happening with the FDVRTs, in particular with WA Police. We feel it's really an important time to bring all the partner agencies together. The other sort of lesser priorities, that everything seems to be a priority, but there are a couple of lesser ones, but we also want to sort of really have that focus on the monitoring and evaluation of the response teams going forward, really bringing in data where we can to support our decision making, and we're really fortunate that we'll be able to recruit a data analyst into the FDVRT Central to help us with that. And then the project of redeveloping the triage application. So that's fairly well where we're at. Hopefully in the next couple of weeks you'll see some more communication come out about FDVRT Central if you're involved in the FDVRTs as a key partner agency. But other than that, I think I've pretty well used up my time there, Nicole. So are we happy to just sort of hold it there and we can take some questions after?
Yeah, thanks, Nigel. That was great. Thank you so much for the overview. And I really agree with what Nigel said. The opportunity to stand up FDVRT Central within the office will just give us so many benefits, I think, for all aspects of our work, and it certainly will help us think through the relationship between the response teams into our wider group of funded services, but also our wider service systems from the point of view of how we approach our commissioning work. But it's also fundamental to how this agency works in its responses to family violence. So it absolutely impacts on our practice stream. It impacts on all of our service design and system work, as well as is really part of that bedrock for this state around building our integrated responses. So, we see the FDVRTs as being really central to the way that we do our business in the family violence area, and I'm really committed to see how we can support and grow those teams in a way that gets us to where we want to be around being really appropriately resourced to both provide those timely responses after a police call out, but also to be really well equipped to deal with the higher risk and more complex cases, and to be able to wrap those responses around those children and families. So thank you, Nigel. I really appreciate you making the time today. And if you've got questions, please post them in the chat and we'll come to them at the end, and Nigel will still be here and he'll be able to answer them. Our next item is the Common Risk Assessment and Risk Management Framework. And we don't have Kerry-Ann with us, so I'll probably just update you on this piece of work, and then if Kerry-Ann joins, then she can add in on that when she arrives. But essentially, an action item in the first action plan of Path to Safety was about refreshing the Common Risk Assessment and Risk Management Framework. And I think really this, for me, like the family and domestic violence response teams, is a really essential part of our overall system response to family violence. It's part of our kind of like basic framework for how we operate, and for really spelling out what it is that we're trying to do and what we're trying to achieve, and trying to, provide more of a focus on what our sort of minimum expectation is around pathways for women and children or victim survivors through the service system and what they can expect or experience along the way, commencing from point of identification through risk assessment and risk management. So you would all know that the last edition of the Common Risk Assessment, which was the second edition, was released, I think, around 2015, and it probably hasn't had a solid review or update since then, and many things have changed. So our practice contexts have changed in many cases, our legislative environment has changed, including changes to the ways that we're allowed to share and exchange information. And we've also had, a range of growth in practice in other jurisdictions that we can learn from. So, we look to Victoria and we can look to the Mara model over there. We look to other jurisdictions who all really fundamentally operate with a base framework around risk assessment and risk management. So we're really invested in doing this work. We're really keen to do it alongside the commissioning, so it makes sense, all of these parts together. And I'm very pleased that Kerry-Ann has joined us, because she's going to tell us a little bit about, I guess some of the approach, but really, Kerry-Ann, all I've been doing is saying how important this is to me and to us, and we're really committed to it. Excellent.
I was actually here the whole time. I don't know why it wasn't working, so I went out and I've just come back in again.
Perfect. Thank you for doing that, because I was getting worried that I was going to have to present to myself.
Yeah, that was really weird. Anyway, and because I noticed my camera wasn't on, I just thought, oh, maybe you'll put the camera on or something. Anyway, never mind. I'm here.
You're here. Wonderful. So the Department of Communities has contracted Kerry-Ann to do this piece of work for us. So please let me hand over to Kerry-Ann to talk to us about a little bit about how this work is going to go. And again, if you've got any questions, please post them in the chat. Kerry-Ann will be with us at the end and we can answer questions at the end.
Yeah. Okay. Bear with me. I actually tested positive for COVID last night, so I'm starting to experience firsthand this brain fog that people were talking about. But basically, in a nutshell, that we know the Common Risk Assessment Framework is a little bit out of date. I guess it was last updated in 2016. The main message I would like to say up front is that actually the framework itself is really sound and really solid. It's not that there's that it's got information that's not correct. It's just that we know that there have been advances in research. There's been information, new information coming along, and there's also some feedback from stakeholders that maybe the CRARMF as it currently exists doesn't quite meet the needs for the service system in WA the way we want it to. So we really want to build on the existing good practice that is already out there. So we don't want to reinvent wheels. We want to incorporate and add to what's already working really well. It really needs to support the coordinated collaborative service delivery. The whole purpose of the CRARMF is to improve that integrated service system responses and help us provide, work together better to provide those holistic responses. One of the things I guess we want to do is identify where the current gaps are and contemporise it. So update, use the research to update what we know, bring it up, address any gaps. So for example, we know responding to adolescents is could be quite unique. They're both victims and perpetrators often at the same time. So, how we engage adolescents and work with adolescents is not addressed in the current CRARMF. But it might be something that we want to look at. We want to update some of the practice contexts that include updating the legislation and make sure that their current practices as they are, I suppose, set out or encouraged fit with our current legislation. And one of the other things that's come up, obviously we want to embed practices around engaging and responding to perpetrators more clearly. We definitely have room to expand and build on that. I'm aware that there are a number of other projects around, there's a perpetrator framework, things like that being developed. So it's got to be something that works with our other frameworks that we're encouraging, and it's not there to conflict or compete with, but they should work hand in hand. And we want to think about things like the tools. So some of the feedback that we've had is that the risk assessment tool that's it's provided as an example is may not be the best fit. So we want to have a look at, does that need changing, improving, updating, or the screening tool? How can we provide better resources so that the service system is better supported to do what it needs to do? As far as how we're going to do that, there is basically, we're going to have a number of workshops. We're going to have some surveys to get out there. I guess I'm open to people want to contact me privately, individually. I can do kind of, Teams or phone conversations. So however we need to gather that information, there's some flexibility. One of the first workshops that we're going to have will be actually to focus on how is the CRARMF currently being used, and what are the strengths, I guess, and issues that we need to be working towards fixing, and think about the purpose. So we need to have that first workshop to really clarify what the CRARMF is going to be and how it's going to fit in the service system. The other, sorry, now see, complete blank. Reference group. That's what I knew. There was one more important thing. Yeah, one of the first steps will be we will be putting out expressions of interest or encouraging people who are interested to form a reference group that will be our key go-to for reviewing and working on and developing the CRARMF itself. Does that kind of cover it, Nicole?
Sure does. Thank you so much, Kerry-Ann. That was great. And I suppose maybe just the last bit is probably about timeframes. And this is a piece of work that we really, Kerry-Ann certainly started work, so something we really want to get going soon. So between now and the next webinar, you'll certainly hear from us about options to get engaged in different things around common risk assessment redevelopment. But we will be holding it all together with our commissioning work. So really making sure that anything we talk about in the context of common risk assessment informs our commissioning plan and vice versa, so that we're, making sure that we make best use of all of our different sort of sector engagements and consultations. Thanks, Kerry-Ann. I just checked the time. So the last item that I wanted to give you an update on today is the commissioning work that we're doing around family and domestic violence services. So I've put 3 slides in this slide deck that are identical to last time. So I'm not going to go through them in detail, but I put them here for context for when we send them out for anybody that hasn't had familiarity with this project before. As we have previously kind of briefed you on, the focus of our current work is on a submission to government for an uplift in funding for family and domestic violence refuges and safe houses. And to that end, Linda, if I can actually get you to scroll down to 2 or 3 more. One more. We have been continuing to work with the expert reference group, the most recent meeting being on the 8th of August. And the progress of where we're up to is that we've been taking the time to source data from your progress reports and from the specialist homelessness services collection to start to really build that profile around the business and activities of refuges and safe houses. So both to demonstrate demand, to demonstrate complexity of the client group, to demonstrate the volume of activity and work, but also to demonstrate where we're not meeting need. So although we've got a current sort of pool of investment in services and we're servicing X number of clients, there are another substantial number of women and children who aren't able to access crisis accommodation for all the range of reasons that we all know about. So the reason for doing that data analysis is that it's effectively about helping us set out the rationale that will go with our financial analysis on what the shortfall in funding currently is. So in parallel to that data analysis and building that kind of policy argument for the uplift in funding, we've also started the financial analysis. And that financial analysis is currently progressing through an examination of your financial statements and comparison to funding level, but that's really just the baseline of it. That's how it's starting, and it will grow from there. We are on track to start the sector engagement in early September, and you'll hear from us in the next week with invitations. The beginning of that process will be 2 workshops that will be identical. They'll both be online, so people can opt into whichever time is more suitable and convenient for them. We'll send out essentially like a pre-reading pack that speaks to both the data and financial analysis that we've done so far, and then the purpose of those workshops is really to build and refine that information. And depending on where we get to, we'll schedule further opportunities for engagement, but we'll just make those decisions as we go, depending on how much more information we think we need and how comfortable people are with how we're reflecting back what their sort of current state experience is. The other thing that we have been doing is, I guess, just a bit of a current state map around capacity for crisis accommodation across the state relative to investments. So that mapping work is well underway. And we're planning to do a brief census, so a short survey to come out to services. It will be voluntary and optional. You do not have to do it if you don't want to, but it will certainly value add to the data sets that we've already got and help us to compile a more consistent picture of kind of what current state operations are for refuges and safe houses in Western Australia at the moment, including things like how many staff do you have, how many shifts do you run a day, how many people would you have on per shift, really just to start to get an understanding of where we're currently at in the way that some of these services are operating, which will help supplement the information we get about clients from your progress reports and from specialist homelessness services data collection. The other thing that I really wanted to flag that we've also started doing, which I haven't previously mentioned in webinars, is we're really starting to compile information about the strategic asset management part of the commissioning plan. So that piece of work doesn't relate to our submission around funding uplift, but it's something that we really want to get some early visibility to, including how many family violence assets do we have in the WA community, what is the condition of those assets, what commitments have we made in various places around refurbishment, and then really getting to a place where we've got a really clearly articulated plan about what are the priorities for rebuild, refurbishment, and how we're going to grow our base of crisis accommodation and transitional housing in the community. So that piece of work we're just doing the early thinking on in terms of getting all the data inputs together, and then we'll be starting to have a think through how we pull that together for a more strategic approach to growing or making sure we've got fit for purpose buildings, but also making sure that we've got a plan for growing the capacity for service delivery within those buildings over a period of time. So we have one more ERG meeting scheduled in about a week and a half, which will be the sort of last meeting of that group before we lead into the sector engagement, although that group will keep meeting. But you will hear from us, as I said, with invitations to those sector workshops will be coming out in the next week. And you'll have the choice to choose between one of 2 options. And if we end up oversubscribed, then we can add a third. So we'll just work with how it goes. So I think that brings us to the end of everything I wanted to talk to you about today in terms of some of the current activity in the office. So I'm going to look to my colleagues who are going to tell me about questions that might have come through in the chat during that presentation.
Yeah, so I think the first one is more for Nigel. Will CRS providers be given an opportunity to inform the FDVRT redesign?
Yes, certainly. I'm happy to answer that one. Yeah, look, definitely. It's been a bit of a work in progress, really. So what we've kind of always thought is, and where we're at the moment, because I think the big obvious question that we often get is the funding that we got, 7.7 million in that phase of the redesign, really does not alleviate any of that staff, that pressure on that front line for all those staff who are just managing all those, 45,000 police reports every year. So there is another phase of redesign, and that really is looking at at how do we actually alleviate some of that workload pressures. The phase that we're doing now with the FDVRT Central is vitally important. Like, it's one of those things we can't, you know, we have to get our, I've used this term before, we kind of have to get our shop in order really before we go into any sort of, you know, meaty redesign around alleviating that workload. So we really need to get our shop in order in terms of the governance and oversight and some of those other things in the workforce development and training. So there will be another part, a phase of redesign. It's not something that we have been looking at closely in the recent little while because, you know, our priority has been about implementing and spending the funding that we've currently got, and we've always thought that that's something that we can focus on a bit down the track. We are kind of being pulled back into having a bit of a think about the redesign. So there will be opportunity for all staff to sort of have some input around that, but we kind of want to, in the first instance, kind of get our thinking right as well, and sort of the parameters, because obviously I think, you know, hopefully people can recognise that it's not just as simple as sort of putting on more staff into this response team model. It's about how do we do it differently, and Nicole had sort of briefly touched on that before. How do we actually get people to focus on high risk? But to do that, we need to then unpack lots of things like the actual joint agency risk assessment approach, which we all know needs a lot of work. So there's a lot to sort of work through. Finding those touch points, yeah, to engage CRS, we're certainly thinking about it, and we'll be able to have conversations along the way. Sorry, I can't give any sort of definitive timelines, but certainly recognise the need to be able to speak to all our key stakeholders as we do that.
Thanks, Nigel.
Yeah.
And I guess, like, from a timeframe point of view, at least for me, you know, we can't have a commissioning plan that represents an ideal state around our family violence service delivery without representing the response teams in that and how they connect and fit in that wider sort of funded service space as well as wider service system space. And we've really made the commitment that we will have that strategic commissioning plan by 30 June of next year, and that we'll be starting that really concerted design work once we're through the submission around the funding uplift. So I really see that these two things kind of have to go hand in hand. And, you know, certainly I think, as Nigel said, the focus has been on getting FDVRT Central established, but really after that, I don't think there's any reason why we wouldn't then be turning our attention to the redesign and making sure that everybody who's a party to the response teams now, including those immediate partners and those sector partners that are immediately impacted by referrals from the response teams, are part of that design process and work. Emma?
This is around the CRARMF. How do you propose to include cultural appropriate practice into the framework? And then the second question, which is relevant as well, and have a stronger cultural reference so it's more applicable to Aboriginal women.
Yeah, look, really good questions, and I'd say from the outset that needing to improve their cultural relevance of the CRARMF is one of the big aims and intents of the work that we want to do. As far as how we're going to do it, at this stage, I feel like, I mean, I'm certainly not an expert myself. I feel like that's where we would hope that we get good representation in the reference group, that we can have those experts or people that have the knowledge to help figure out how much of this information do we need to put into the CRARMF, how is it going to look, what kind of guidance, I guess, that we want to hold there, and how, because I'm aware that there's also a family safety strategy being created. So part of the, I guess, early thinking is that some of the you know, in the intro to the CRARMF, for instance, there will be recommendations that it's read in conjunction with, for example, the perpetrator framework and the family safety strategy, so that will hold additional information. But absolutely 100% agree that there needs to be conversations and we need to improve our cultural relevance in the current CRARMF. Did you want to add anything, Nicole, to that?
Thanks, Kerry, and that was great. I mean, really, the only thing I just wanted to add is that as part of the 2017 election commitments, we have been funding an Aboriginal organisation to do sort of practice development work around culturally responsive and culturally secure family violence work for Aboriginal people and families. And I just said that in a very awkward way, but you know, I think that's probably going to be the first port of call, is look to the work that they've been doing in that space, and then look to our Aboriginal organisations and our Aboriginal staff that are working on the front line of this to understand, you know, how we can do this work differently for Aboriginal people and families in a way that's more relevant and more sensitive to risk, which is the key issue. So, yeah.
Are we able to put Kerry Ann's contact details on the webinar somewhere?
Certainly can.
Yeah. This one's for you, Nicole. Have you considered there may be federally funded FDV programs to take into account when considering activity and stats?
Yes, we have considered it. So we have been having this back and forth discussion about scope, and I almost want to ask a follow-up question, and I might, if that particular person who's asked this question would be comfortable, if they could post their name and email address in the chat, then I might follow up with you afterwards. The most immediate work is the funding uplift for refuges and safe houses, and to my knowledge, though I'm very likely to be wrong, we don't have any crisis accommodation services that receive operational funding from the Commonwealth for delivery of crisis accommodation in WA, I think. So I think for this immediate body of work, our focus is on our state-funded refuges and safe houses, and so the data sets that we've got around that are representative of those services that we're funding. But I might follow up with that particular person that asked the question to check that that there's not sort of things happening that I'm not aware of that we need to be bringing into view here. And that's it for questions?
That's it for questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you everyone for joining us today. As we have been doing, we'll schedule another webinar in 4 weeks. We'll be happy to take suggestions for what you'd like to hear at the next webinar. It will always include a standing update on commissioning, but we'd be really happy to take suggestions or nominations for other programs or projects that you're really keen to hear about. So thank you very much for your time today. We'll post the slides and the recording on our website, and we'll also send them around to the group for anybody who wants to have an opportunity to link up and listen. So thank you also to Nigel and Kerry Ann for joining us. It was great to have you online.
No worries, thanks.
You're welcome.